Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a new video for my newest series in which I cover the factions and houses of Ice and Fire Total War, War for Westeros. This is a mod for the game Total War Attila that overhauls it and bases it in Westeros, the primary setting of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the Song of Ice and Fire books, the mod being linked in the description of course. In particular, this mod is based off of the books, with the units and factions in it taking inspiration from their book counterparts, as compared to the live action shows, which is something I appreciate. Because this mod chooses to discard the visual style of the show, it means a lot of the units in the game look more historically authentic for starters, which is nice to see, and which is something we'll touch on later down the line. In this video, I'll be breaking down the faction of the Riverlands, specifically the sole house that has in its roster House Tully, looking at the history and inspiration behind the faction and its roster, before turning to its units and looking at how historically authentic the units' arms and armor are. If you like the sounds of that and want to see more, like and subscribe and the content will keep coming. As of making this video, the mod is in the very early alpha, however even at such a stage, a lot of factions, units and maps already exist, which means there's more than enough content for me to cover for a while. Looking at the Riverlands, it's named after the Trident River which splits it apart, positioned in the centre of the Seven Kingdoms, being bordered to the north by the North, to the east by the Vale of Arryn, the southeast by the Crownlands, to the south the Reach and the Stormlands, with the Westerlands bordering them to the west and the Iron Islands also being close by. This, combined with the general lack of natural boundaries and defences, means that whenever major wars break out in Westeros, the Riverlands is almost always a battlefield, as we've seen during Aegon's conquest, the Dance of the Dragons, the Blackfire Rebellions, Robert's Rebellion, and most prominently in the books, the War of the Five Kings. For millennia, different noble houses came to rule the region as the King of the Trident or the King of River and Hills, many being local houses, while at some times the Storm Kings would conquer the region, although at the time of Aegon's conquest, the region had been under the control of House Hoare of the Iron Islands for several generations. Leading their fellow subjugated houses in rebellion against the Ironborn, House Tully would ally with Aegon the Conqueror, overthrowing House Hoare, which would go extinct, Aegon naming House Tully as the Lords Paramount of the Trident. For the next 3 centuries, House Tully would support the Iron Throne loyally, although due to never being kings the same way the paramount lords of the Seven Kingdoms had been, House Tully would never exercise as much control over their bannermen, who were often stronger than them. During the Dance of the Dragons, House Tully and the Riverlords would prove a major boon for Rhaenyra Targaryen, destroying many enemy armies and strengthening both her and her heir's position. During Robert's Rebellion, House Tully would join the rebels, although at the cost of Ned Stark and Jon Arryn, 2 of the leaders of the rebellion marrying the daughters of Lord Hoster Tully. House Tully would overthrow the Targaryens before spending years upholding the new King Robert's peace, fighting in the Greyjoy Rebellion for the Iron Throne. During the War of the Five Kings, the bulk of the fighting would take place in the Riverlands, which would be ravaged by the conflict, with House Tully almost prematurely being taken out of the war due to the poor decisions made by Edmure Tully, acting as his sick father's representative, with the Lannisters practically controlling the Riverlands up until Robb Stark and his Northmen liberated the region, the Tullys and the Riverlords swearing allegiance to the King in the North. As of the most recent book, the Riverlands are under the control of the Iron Throne, and House Tully has been supplanted as the ruling house of the Riverlands by House Frey, which has betrayed them, Edmure Tully and his pregnant wife on their way to being taken into captivity by the Lannisters. In terms of historical inspiration for the factions, there's a couple main ones that stand out due to them also sharing a history of being unfortunately located in the perfect position to have wars fought over them, that being Poland, Germany, and the lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands, all of which tended to repeatedly be the locations of wars in the Middle Ages and afterwards, or were known for being very divided when it came to governance, the same way the Riverlands are by their fractious lords, major rivers also helping to split up these regions too. With all that said, we'll turn to the units, beginning by looking at the generals, each faction normally having a heavy cavalry unit as a general, which was normally a regular unit in the roster, as well as a unique character from the books leading their own unit. In this case, the unique general for House Tully is Lord Paramount Edmure Tully, the Warden of the Trident, which was his title given to him by his nephew Robb Stark, the King in the North. Edmure is the younger brother of Catelyn Tully and the heir to Riverrun and House Tully. Unfortunately, Edmure is a man whose emotions and decency make him a bad military leader. His decisions during the early days of the War of the Five Kings to split up his army and have his men try and cover as much ground to protect the peasants of the region, leading to the armies of the Riverlands quickly being obliterated by the Lannisters, and many more innocents suffering than would have happened otherwise, with his survival only occurring due to the arrival of the northern army led by Robb. Later on in the war, he would change the course of the war by refusing to allow the Lannister army to cross his lands back to their home territory, where Robb was planning on ambushing them. instead attacking the Lannisters and holding their position so long that they were able to get word of Stannis' attack on King's Landing and instead fall back, joining up with the Tyrells to beat Stannis and losing any chance the North had of winning the war by taking out Tywin Lannister. Essentially, what I'm saying is that while the man may have a kind heart, his kind heart may as well have doomed his family and those he was sworn to protect. With that rant out of the way, let's look at Edmure himself. For starters, he rides a mostly unarmoured horse, the only bit of protection it has being a plate chanfron protecting its head. That said, its head is better protected than Edmure's given he lacks a helmet, which is always a bad thing. If you want to show off your hero's face, you can just put an open face helmet on them and keep them safe instead of doing the dangerous thing and go into battle without a helmet. That said, it's nice to see his red beard and hair, which he's mentioned as having in the book, so it's a nice bit of attention to detail. For his chest, Edmure wears what I'm assuming is an arming shirt with long mail sleeves, over which he wears a partially gilded plate cuirass decorated with the shroud of House Tully, or gorget being worn over the cuirass, which should instead be worn under it if historical accuracy is what they're going for. Attached to his cuirass, instead of folds to protect its upper legs, are a scale skirt which is meant to be a motif reflecting the fish of their sigil. Big plate pauldrons protect Edmure's shoulders, while scale spolders provide protection for the upper arms, leather gloves being worn instead of gauntlets. For his upper leg he wears leather cuisses with plate strips attached over the top, his greaves sharing the same design. This design of armour I'm pretty sure is known of when it comes to greaves, especially in the early Middle Ages and the Migration era, as is when it comes to cuisses. Regardless, it's an odd design choice compared to the rest of his armour. Regular pollens protect his knees, however they have mail attached for some reason, while his feet are protected with what I can only describe as scale shoes which I don't think existed historically, blue and red cloak finishing off his look. For defense he uses a heater shield decorated with the jumping shroud of House Tully, his heater shield having a metal rim which is historically inaccurate, heater shields lacking them and instead having rawhide rims. For a weapon, Edmure uses an arming sword with quite the long blade, the thing looking closer to a bastard sword or longsword in length, but lacking the hilt such swords had. Overall, Edmure resembles a knight of the 15th century, although all the scale components of his armour give him an aesthetic mixed with that of earlier warriors of Eastern Europe. Turning to his men, they ride horses with a mix of armour, some lacking it entirely while others just have chanfrons, while others have chanfrons and full caparisons brightly decorated with the blue and red of House Tully, these men resembling mounts used by cavalrymen in the 12th and 13th centuries. As for the riders themselves, they mostly wear the same armour as Edmure, although they have articulated plate gauntlets compared to his leather gloves. All of them have mail pants over which they have regular greaves, cuisses and pollens, articulated sabatons also being worn, giving them the appearance of a 15th century men-at-arms when it comes to their lower half, with far better historical equipment than Edmure. For helmets, the men wear a variety of bassinets, some of them having a spikier and chunkier visor than historical examples, giving them a weird look, while others wear what I only can describe as a great bassinet with a cage-like visor, which were used historically although more for tournament use than on the battlefield. Using the same shield as Edmure, his troops keep arming swords at their side while using lances as their main weapon, some of the lances having Tully pennants attached. Overall, with their helmets, they look like early 15th century men-at-arms apart from all the scale armour. As a unit, these gold tier 3 heavy shock cavalry make for your best option of general, having better stats than the other options available to a respective Tully player. While I'm not a fan of Edmure himself, he does lead a tough unit which I more than recommend fielding and using either as a reserve or as a spear tip of your heavy cavalry. Moving on from the general units, we'll turn to the regular troops starting with the Protectors of the Ford. Looking at the men, they all wear helmets, which is nice to see, having a mix of different versions of kettle helms, a helmet which saw widely produced from the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages, especially by lower class soldiers such as bowmen, who couldn't be encumbered by heavy combat helmets. Alongside their helmets, many of the men wear either fabric mantles or mail coifs, giving them extra head protection and comfort, keeping their cheeks and necks safe. For their bodies, they all wear a gambus and hauberk, or shirt, as well as padded pants, some having padded armour for chest protection, while others wear mail shirts with scale shirts over the top, others just wearing scale over their gambeson, while others wear gambeson, mail and then brigandine, making for some very well armoured crossbowmen. All the men wear leather gloves, or for their legs some have pollens and others have greaves in the same style as Edmure, or having a variety of leather boots. For weapons, the crossbowmen keep a dagger and a falchion at their side, while their main weapon is the crossbow. Crossbows are one of the most widely used weapons in medieval Europe due to their ease of production and training compared with bows which took a lifetime to become proficient with. As such, the weapon makes a lot of sense to be seen in the hands of the rivermen, who are more technologically advanced than their northern neighbours. Looking at the unit officer, he wears a morion helmet, which is a late medieval helmet developed on the Iberian Peninsula during the early 16th century. That would see use all the way into the 17th century, used throughout Europe, although it was most famously used by the conquistadors. The officer's morion also coming with a bever to protect the lower face and neck alongside a gorget. The gorget is worn over the top of a plate cuirass, identical to that used by Edmure's household guard, which is worn over a gambeson hauberk, worn itself over a mail hauberk. Officer having gilded pauldrons, van braces, counters, and articulated gauntlets, his lower legs having cuisses as well as gilded pollens and greaves, sabatons, and a blue and red cloak finishing off his look. For a shield, the officer uses a small variant of a pavese shield decorated with the Tully sigil, a late period arming sword being used in combination with it. Overall, the officer resembles a heavy infantryman from the 1550s or so. Looking at the unit as a whole, these silver tier 2 medium crossbow infantry provide your army with ranged firepower, only to thin out enemy ranks and contend with enemy archers. A very useful unit that can put out significant damage due to the armor-piercing properties of crossbow bolts. I'd recommend including this unit in your armies, although care should be taken when deploying them, given that they can only shoot straight, meaning in sieges there can be trouble with them, and that they can have their line of fire blocked by your own army, making maneuver critical when it comes to them. Overall though, a more than solid choice for a Tully army. Moving on to the next unit, the River Run pikemen make an appearance. Very well armoured, the men all wear a mix of kettle helms, bassinets and salets with an extended brim acting as a face shield for the upper half of the face. All these helmets seeing service in the late Middle Ages, some of them having fabric coifs attached and others having mail for extra protection. For their torsos, they wear a mail shirt with a mix of different armours over the top, some having scale shirts over the top for added protection, while others wear various styles of brigandines, with some having brigandine over mail, then covered with a plate placard to protect the stomach. For arms, the men all have mail sleeves, however some have pauldrons, van braces and articulated gauntlets providing protection over the top, while others have spalders, van braces and leather gloves, and yet others have arms completely covered in plate armour, pauldrons, rear braces, cowders, van braces and articulated gauntlets, keeping their arms safe, many having small rondels for their armpits. Moving down to their legs, some wear mail pants and leather boots, while others just have pollens for their knees, and some have pollens, greaves and mail shoes, generally making for great examples of 15th century infantry. For a weapon, the men have daggers at their sides, but for their main weapon, choose to use both hands to wield a pretty normal looking pike with metal reinforcements on the shaft. Pike warfare being widespread across Europe at the end of the Middle Ages and the first few centuries of the early modern period. These men not looking out of place in a pike block fighting in Italy in the early 16th century. Skipping the officer who's identical to the previous one, these silver tier 2 pikemen are a highly useful unit, providing your army with an asset that's equally at home on the offensive or defending, making for an almost impenetrable wall which enemies can't break and which is certain death for cavalry, being a solid redoubt that makes choke points in your fortresses that much harder to break, or when attacking they can grind a path through entire enemy armies when provided with enough support. Support is the key word, as if you leave these guys open and expect them to win battles by themselves, you'll quickly lose a powerful unit as they're vulnerable to marauding cavalry flanking them and archers due to their lack of shields when it comes to blocking projectiles. That means in order to use them properly, you should have these guys flanked by less vulnerable infantry where your archers and cavalry clear the threat of enemy range units, allowing them to plough into the enemy infantry. Overall, a great multi-use unit so long as they're supported properly. Turning to the next unit, the longbows of River Run look identical to the protectors of the ford with the exception of their choice of weapon, using the longbow instead of the crossbow. Longbows were most famously used in England during the late Middle Ages, although armies in continental Europe did experiment with them as a way of countering the threat of English longbowmen, the weapon having a far better rate of fire than a longbow, although it lacked the power of the crossbow as well as range. Still a supremely deadly weapon, it makes sense to see them in the hands of the men of the Riverlands. Skipping the officer, as a unit, these silver tier 2 medium bow infantry provide your army with an extra option when it comes to ranged warfare. Instead of going one way or the other when it comes to the longbowmen or the crossbowmen, I instead suggest using both in combination, the longbowmen being able to shoot in trajectories impossible for the crossbowmen, while the crossbows are significantly harder hitting, each covering each other's weak points and making for a stronger army. Overall, a very useful unit and one you'll be more than happy to have sitting away, whittling down enemy numbers, although you should try and keep them safe from horsemen. Moving on to the perfect unit for keeping them safe from horsemen, we have the River Spear Sergeants, armoured identically to the pikemen. These troops combine the same shields as the officers, decorated with various styles of the House Tully sigil with spears, some bearing Tully pennants while all resemble Japanese yari with a straight blade. Skipping the officer, these silver tier 2 medium spear infantry are a core part of your army, being a solid defensive line that can endure more damage than the pikemen while not being capable of putting out as much damage in turn. As such, I'd use these guys to hold weak points so as to buy enough time for the more proactive elements in your army to begin doing their thing. They give them more critical to success in sieges where holding the line is the most important thing you can do. A terrific unit will move on to the next one, which is their sword counterpart, the River Men-at-Arms. Equipped identically to the previous unit, the only thing that differentiates them is their weapon of choice, the arming sword of which various types are used, all of them appearing to be later era examples. Skipping an officer who we've seen before, these are the offensive heart of your army when it comes to your infantry. Being silver tier 2 medium sword infantry can go toe to toe with most expected enemies. When it comes to their role, these guys work alongside your cavalry to roll up enemy lines as quickly as possible, while in sieges, they steadily weaken and push through defensive positions, pouring in behind your more offensive infantry to overrun the enemy. All in all, a very useful unit, even if they do have the wrong historical name, men-at-arms being heavy cavalry of the late Middle Ages rather than regular infantry. Moving on to the next unit, the catapults, we see that they're crewed by the archers essentially, although the men have two falchions at their side in case of melee, making them surprisingly well armed for lesser infantry. As a unit shared by every faction, the catapults are a critical bit of siege equipment, being useful on the open battlefield to thin up enemy formations, although they really shine in sieges, where they can destroy fortifications and punch holes in walls, allowing your men easy access, or when defending, can attack enemy hordes and destroy their siege equipment, making defences easier. Generally a highly useful unit for all factions. For House Tully, I'd say that the catapults are a bit more useful. To begin with, when attacking in sieges, this unit allows you to carve up defending units before engaging in combat, something highly useful for a faction that lacks dedicated shock infantry which are made specifically for breaking formations, meaning a unit like this makes it that much easier for your regular swordsmen to do the job. Vice versa, when defending, you lack shock infantry to destroy enemy units that are extended and stretched out, this unit giving you the power to do enough damage to enemy formations that by the time they're on your walls, your swordsmen can deal with them in their weakened state and pursue them. The unit essentially covering for some of the deficiencies made by a lack of shock infantry. Overall, a highly useful unit that would always have its absence felt if it was removed from the faction roster, but which would be that much worse for House Tully, proving how useful it really is. Moving on, the next unit are the River Sworn Swords, who I'm assuming are meant to represent the household guard of House Tully. Armoured almost identically to Edmure's bodyguard, these men wear different helmets, using a mix of morions and salays combined with bevers for almost full head and face protection. Lacking cloaks, these men use arming swords in combination with heater shields, the heater shields having inaccurate metal rims. Overall, while the men look quite good, I'm disappointed that they don't use polearms. That would have made them a great choice of shock infantry, and a good depiction of late medieval warriors with advanced plate armor choosing to use two-handed weapons instead of swords, mostly incapable of doing damage to heavily armoured foes. Looking at the unit officer, he skips the gambeson the other officers wear and instead has mail underneath his plate, giving him better protection, also discarding his cloak. As a unit, these gold tier 3 very heavy melee infantry are one that I more than recommend for your army. Not only to stiffen up your front lines, but also to act as shock infantry, when the spare tip of your melee infantry, using their elite status and stats to break through enemy weak points, your regular swordsmen extending the breach after them. A very useful unit, recruit them in the moment you can, as they do pretty damn well on the defensive and can also be used in sieges to destroy exhausted enemy units when deployed as a fresh reserve. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Outriders of House Tully. Armoured identically to the longbowmen and crossbowmen but mounted on armoured horses, their troops use the same shields as the regular infantry in combination with a mix of arming swords we've seen previously. Skipping the officer is equipped the same as the previous one but on horseback using a lance in conjunction with his heater shield. These silver tier 2 medium melee cavalry are one of the few mounted assets you have available, better suited to catching out and destroying shock cavalry than launching devastating charges on enemy units, though I would recommend using them to harass enemy lines after destroying the opposition's mounted forces. Overall, a pretty useful unit and one whose name is quite apt, Outriders being lightly equipped horsemen like these troops, although it would have been a bit nicer if they were more ragtag in appearance, such as not all of them wearing the colours of House Tully. With that said, we'll move on to the next unit, the River Sworn Spears, are essentially the River Sworn Swords but using a partisan rather than an arming sword. Partisans being a pretty common form of polearm used in the early modern period, typically used by guardsmen in a similar way to halberds. The weapon more than generally suiting the aesthetic of the troops. Skipping the gilded officer, as a unit these gold tier 3 very heavy spearmen aren't quite as critical as their sword counterparts, given House Tully doesn't lack adequate spearmen. Definitely a step up from the River Spear Sergeants when it comes to stats. I'd normally only use these guys as a reserve to strengthen your lines if you're really going for a late game elite army, as the heart of your spear line, although normally the Spear Sergeant should get the job done. Still a great unit however, and one that really well complements their sword counterparts. Moving on to the next unit, we have the second elite ranger unit we've seen so far in the current faction breakdowns, the River Run Rangers. Armour-wise, the men all seem to wear a mail shirt with a gambeson shirt over it, their heads lacking helmets as they're choosing to wear hooded cloaks and veils for stealth operations, which makes sense given that these are a stealth ranger unit. Apart from that, some of the men wear quilted pants with leather boots, while others have the same type of greaves as Edmure, with a mix of leather and metal strips, some having leather spaulders for their upper arms, whilst others lack them, almost all however having fluted van braces and leather gloves, all wearing a mix of either leather or metal decorated with leather pauldrons. Arming swords at their side for combat, the main weapon of these men is a longbow, which is a devastating effect. Skipping their standard officer, as a unit, these gold tier 3 medium archers give your army an unexpected asset, allowing them to guerrilla deploy ahead of your army and decimate enemy forces with the ability to shoot and remain undetected, meaning you can whittle away an enemy army without ever engaging as long as they don't accidentally run their cavalry into you. Great archers, these troops are pretty good at melee combat too, easily holding their own against regular swordsmen. That said, I wouldn't recommend using them as your first line of melee infantry, first using up their ammunition before deploying them as a support unit to carve up enemy flanks, something they'll do quite well. Overall, quite the unit to have up your sleeve ready to hit an unsuspecting enemy with. Moving on to the final unit the faction has available to it, we have the Tully Knights. Armed and armoured identically to Edmure's household guard with the exception that their officer is the gilded armour seen in use by the River Sworn officers, with the same spiky chunky style of bassinet being used for head protection. These gold tier 3 very heavy shock cavalry are not only the heaviest horse you can field, they can also serve as faction general. Given that Edmure and his guard have better stats than these guys, I recommend choosing that unit over this one, although if you want a cheaper, more basic general unit, these guys will do great, being great at providing the armies of House Tully with an iron fist strong enough and mobile enough to break most enemy formations and stand toe-to-toe with the equivalent cavalry fielded by most foes. A devastating unit, I definitely include a few of these in your army build as they help offset the lack of firepower caused by an absence of shock infantry, making rapid destruction of enemy armies a possibility before the casualties begin to rise for your armies. With these guys covered, all the units in the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction as a whole. Overall, House Tully of the Riverlands are a faction that would have all of its corners adequately covered were it not for its lack of shock infantry and polearm troops. This means that the faction has to heavily lean into its regular swordsmen and archers to weaken enemy formations before your cavalry delivers the death blow, having a standard gameplay style but without the extra muscle most other factions have, meaning finesse rather than brute force is generally the way to go. As such, sieges, especially when attacking, are a difficult prospect, with the adequate mounted strength of the faction which normally offsets that disadvantage being of very little use, requiring you to more effectively use your available assets to eke out a win. Overall, while I'd say they're a more than viable faction, they can make for a bit of a nice challenge due to their inherent limitations, though the ability to swap between a more or less standard infantry army and a mounted army means you have flexibility which is always appreciated, with the faction having a few tricks up its sleeve which more than evens the score. In comparison to the previous factions we've looked at, these guys tend to be a bit of a polar opposite to House Stark, which generally has pretty strong and diverse infantry, but is lacking in horsemen. These guys overall being more dynamic, but lacking that explosive ability to quickly shift up the battlefield the way House Stark, and more so House Greyjoy, with their extensive shock infantry can. A pretty good faction. I can't wait to see it expanded and see the early game units that will be added in so we can get a more holistic idea of the faction. If you guys have enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments and please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much, for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. Rest assured more videos on this mod and others will be coming up in the future. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.